Good morning. Welcome to Westbridge Church. My name's Jeremiah. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's great to have you with us today. What a beautiful day in October. Wow. Man, I am hoping that this continues until April. One can hope, right? I want to say hello to everybody joining us online. Thanks for joining us there. And in our parent viewing rooms, if you have small children you prefer to keep with you, that's a great option for that. Anybody joining us in our cafe. And real quick, a couple of things I want to mention before we jump into the talk this morning. One is we have 165 middle school and high school students gone this weekend. So if you have a middle schooler here this week and you went over to put them in the service here, and you're like, where is everybody? That's where they're at. They're up in Detroit Lakes. They're at a weekend retreat, and that's just so awesome. It's something that my kids look forward to every single year. And this year, I have 3 of our 4 kids are gone at the retreat. So we've got our teenage son there, and then we've got 2 adult kids that are there as leaders. So that's pretty awesome. And then we just have our 10-year-old just hanging out with us. But I just want to say a massive thank you to all of the volunteers and leaders who are there. We've got a team of adults there that are just there being the kitchen crew, and they're just there making food and hanging out. We've got a bunch of leaders there, but 165 middle schoolers, high schoolers are there, and they're not only experiencing worship and small groups and teaching, but just having a blast doing it. So if you've got middle schoolers, high schoolers, and you missed this one, or you have kids going into middle school or high school, and this is just something, mark that date every year. MEA weekend, they go and do a retreat, so mark your calendars for next year. Don't want to miss that. The other thing I want to say this is a save the date, November 10th. November 10th. I want you to just write that somewhere, save the date, mark it, Sunday morning, September 10th, or November 10th. And here's why. We are going to be launching a series called For the One. For the One. It's going to be a historic series in the life of our church. This is one of those series that is kind of a do not miss series. And I don't play that card very often, but this is one where I'm going, if you can be here on November 10th, you will not want to miss that. We are not only going to be launching a series that day that's going to be just steeped in who we are as a church, where we're going, the vision for the future, but we're launching a whole series of opportunities to come back to the building, to see floor plans and blueprints for an addition to our building so that we can continue to invite more people. We want to double the capacity of this space so we can invite more of our friends and neighbors and coworkers and family members, and most importantly, so that we can have a lot more room for kids and students. This will make the biggest impact in the next generation, even more than us as adults. And so that all kicks off on November 10th. That's just a few weeks away. Save that date. If you can be here, and we're going to start rolling everything out in just a few weeks. So just want to keep that on your radar. All right, we are in week 3 of a series called Culture Clash. And the reason we're calling it Culture Clash, and the reason we've been walking through this series, is really asking this question: how do we live in a culture that is anti-God? How do we live well and love well in a culture that is moving further and further away from God? And as followers of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus, how do you continue to follow Jesus and follow God's ways amidst the pressure to conform, amidst the pressure to sort of just align your life with the cultural norm? And how do you do it in such a way that you don't alienate people who are far from Jesus? How do you stand for Jesus without alienating the people who need his love and his grace? And so we've been looking and walking through this story of Daniel and his friends, and it's really been sort of a playbook for us for how to do this in our culture today. And so we looked at Daniel chapter 1. Daniel and his friends are captured by King Nebuchadnezzar, who is the king of Babylon. It's the Babylonian Empire. They're ruling the known world at this time. And Daniel and his 3 friends are captured from Jerusalem. They're carried off to Babylon, and they spend the rest of their lives living in Babylon. And they actually make a huge impact in that culture without ever shaming people who are from that culture. And it's amazing to look at and learn some lessons from the life of Daniel and his friends. And so the very first week, we looked at Daniel and his 3 friends. Their names were changed, their identities were changed, but they never forgot who God said they were. They never forgot their identities, and they just resolved in their minds. We have a few things that are non-negotiables for us. This is how we're going to live our life. We're not going to shame people from Babylon for being Babylonians, but we are going to live a certain way. And they just resolved and made that decision. And then last week, we looked at this wild story. The King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream And he couldn't even remember the dream, and he wanted his wise men and advisors not only to tell him what he had dreamed, but also to tell him what it meant. And in the midst of that, in the threat of death, Daniel handled himself with wisdom and discretion. And we learned, man, we need to handle ourselves with wisdom and discretion. And we should do that whenever we're dealing with people in our culture today. And now today, we pick up the story in chapter 3. And King Nebuchadnezzar does a very interesting thing as we jump into this story. Here's Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, think about this. This is a guy who does things in the extremes. If you look at all the things that are taking place, this is the new Babylonian Empire, so it's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and it's about 600 years before Jesus comes onto the scene, before Jesus comes to earth. And what you have is this massive gates, massive walls, massive palaces. It's a massive empire, and everything that this guy does is to just awe everyone. He does everything to be a spectacle. And now, in chapter 2, last week, we learned that he had this dream of a massive statue with a gold head. And Daniel said the interpretation was that the gold head represented Nebuchadnezzar and the empire of Babylon. And then the rest of the statue was a bunch of different metals and a bunch of different materials that represented empires that would come after the Nebuchadnezzar and that would come after the empire of Babylon. And now King Nebuchadnezzar is building a huge statue, very similar to the thing that he saw in his dream. But this time he makes the entire thing out of gold. It's almost as if he's saying, I don't want my kingdom to come to an end. If I'm the part of the statue that's gold, I'm going to make the entire statue gold. If the head of gold represents my kingdom, I'll just do the entire thing, and then my kingdom will never end. And so here's what he does. He gathers the people from his kingdom. It says he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. He's going, all right, anybody who has any kind of influence in the empire and anybody who has any kind of influence in my kingdom, I want to get us all together because I want to make sure we are all on the same page. And so here's what we're going to do. He gets them all together, and then a herald shouted out, people of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. And anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. This is a king of extremes, very prone to overreactions. And we've learned this throughout the story, chapter 1, chapter 2. This guy is so extreme. And this isn't just a fascinating turn of events in an ancient story on some continent halfway around the world. The way that empire deals and threatens people of faith is something that all of us deal with. This is extremely relevant for followers of Jesus in the 21st century who are living in the United States of America. Because in the context of our lives, our culture is Babylon. We live in Babylon. And when Peter writes a letter to followers of Jesus, Peter would be one of Jesus' closest friends and followers, and he would write a letter to followers of Jesus living in the first century. And he would actually write to them and say, we are exiles here in this world. It's the same thing that Daniel and his friends were. They were living in exile, and Peter would use that same language and say, it's like we're living in a place in which we don't belong, in which we're not from, in which we do not find our security or identity. But this is where we live. This world isn't our home, but we're foreigners here. It's like we're living in exile. And we are the same because the country and culture in which we find ourselves today is not where we primarily find our citizenship. See, we've become citizens of a new kingdom, and it operates differently than the kingdoms and the cultures of this world. And the threat that comes from the empire is always the same. Conform or pay the price. This is the tension that is always set up between faith and empire. Conform or pay the price. Align your behavior and align your beliefs and align the way that you live your life to the cultural norm, and you'll be good, and everything will be good, and there'll be no friction between us, and there'll be no tension between us. But if you don't, there will be a price to pay. And that is exactly the tension that is set up in Daniel chapter 3 in a major way, and it's the same tension that every single one of us face in smaller ways on a regular basis. Will I conform and will I align my life with what culture says I should, or will I stand for God even if it costs me something? And so here's where we pick up the story. Some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. In other words, they told on them. There are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. In other words, you have a group of people who are jealous. They are jealous of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because they're foreigners, but they've risen through the ranks. They've been promoted ahead of these other guys. And so they come to him, and they're a group of tattletales, snitching. And they're going, oh, look what these guys are doing. And King Nebuchadnezzar is furious. He's going, everybody's supposed to get in line behind me. Everybody's supposed to conform. Everybody's supposed to align with what I thought we were all on the same page here. And so here's what happens. Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true? Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, calls them out, each one by name, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then listen to this line. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power? Listen, guys, I know you got your own God. I know you got this Hebrew Yahweh thing going on and, the God of Israel and all that stuff, and that's fine. But you've got to bow down and worship my God. And if you don't, this is the consequence. This is the price to pay. And I'm just telling you, there is no God that's going to save you then. What God will be able to save you and rescue you then? Have you ever been in a scenario where the world around you, culture around you, there's some kind of cultural norm that's saying, if you do this, then we're all good. Listen, all you have to do is just conform in this one area. All you have to do is just align in this one area. This is the cultural norm. This is the way we all do it. This is the way we all think. This is what we all believe. You just got to get in line. Because if you do, it'll be fine. There won't be any friction. There won't be any tension. We'll be good. But if you don't, your life's going to be a little bit more miserable. There's going to be a price to pay. There's going to be some tension. Life is going to get a little bit more difficult. And here's my guess. I'm assuming nobody is setting up a 90-foot statue in your neighborhood and asking you to bow down to it. I'm assuming that the idols that we're tempted to bow down to aren't physical idols. In fact, I would say the idols that we're tempted to bow down to look very, very different in our culture today, but they're very much as real. In fact, our idols are ideologies. The idol that we are tempted to bow down to isn't a physical statue, but an ideology, a belief system, a way of thinking, a way of living. In fact, Tim Keller has a book called Counterfeit Gods, and in it he writes and describes about the types of idols that we're tempted to bow down to, and he defines what an idol is. Tim Keller would say this: if I have that, ... If I have that, fill in the blank. And for us, it's not necessarily if I bow down to an idol, a statue that's made out of gold. For us, it's if I could get that, if I could just acquire that position at my company, if I could get a little bit more prestige, if I could get that promotion, if I could just get a little bit more money, if I could get a little bit more financial freedom, if I could get that relationship, if I could get him, if I could get her, if I could, whatever it is, fill in the blank, if I could just ... then I'll feel my life has meaning. Then I'll know I have value. Then I'll feel significant and secure. And oftentimes, the idols that we are tempted to go after aren't even necessarily bad things. They're good things that come from God that we're tempted to turn into ultimate things. And we want to replace God with those things. And it's kind of this temptation that all of us face. The temptation for humans from the very beginning has been to transfer our trust away from God and put our trust in something other than God. Adam and Eve, the very first man and woman, if you read the creation narrative, they came to believe that God couldn't be trusted, that somehow God was holding out on them on what they needed most for their life to flourish. And they came to the conclusion, okay, God must be holding out on us, so we've got to take matters into our own hands, and we've got to figure out how to make ourselves happy. And the biggest temptation for every single one of us is to put our trust in something outside of what God says. And so we're tempted to take matters into our own hands and conform and align with what culture tells us will bring us significance and security. But we were created by God to experience significance and security in Him alone. Maybe it's in the way you conduct your business. The temptation is this, like, listen, everybody in our line of work does it this way. You gotta take some shortcuts. You just gotta, it's just the norm. And I know maybe it kind of brushes up against your integrity, but at the end of the day, this is just how everyone in our line of work does it. So you just got to take that shortcut. Trust me, if you do this, it'll just be easier for you. And if you don't, it's going to cause a lot of friction. It's going to cause a lot of tension. Maybe it's in the way that you conduct your dating life or your marriage. Relationally, it's like this is just how everybody in our culture does it. Listen, in dating, this is just how everyone does it. This is how our culture operates. So just do this and there'll be a lot less tension. This is how people operate in marriage. Just do this and there'll be a lot less tension and life will be easier for you. Maybe it's in the way that you conduct yourself when it comes to decisions about sex. This is just how culture handles this. And if you just live life this way, I'm sure it'll be easier for you. You'll face less friction and tension from other people, or maybe it's in the way you conduct your parenting, or the way you handle your finances, or how you deal with other people when it comes to forgiveness. Maybe it's in the way you deal with your neighbors or your kids' teachers or people that you work with, or maybe the way that you manage your time or you manage your resources. And the temptation for every single one of us somewhere along the way is to conform to culture. Here's how culture operates, so just align with that rather than stand for God's ways when those two come into contrast. And we've got a couple options when the heat is on. Number one, you can bow along to get along. Listen, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, guys, I know that you've got your God that you worship. And I'm not even asking you to give that up. But right now, you've got to conform to this. You've got to align with this. This is what we're doing. We're all getting on the same page here. And so you just got to get in line here. And if you do this, I'm going to give you another chance because I'm pretty upset about the fact that you haven't done it already. But I like you guys. I'm going to give you one more shot. You can still worship Yahweh, but just make sure you bow down to the statue as well. Just go with the flow. Take the path of least resistance. Just make your life a little bit easier, regardless of how it impacts your belief system or your faith. And for those of us who are followers of Jesus, when you're working to follow Jesus, when you're attempting to go, okay, I want to become aware of how God wants me to live, and then I want to follow that. And oftentimes in that pursuit, we don't always know the right thing. But the minute that we become aware of what God wants us to do, of how God wants us to live, we realize that our lives don't match up to that. We've got a choice to make. We can either change our lifestyle to align with God's ways, change the way that we live so that it starts to align with God's ways, or we can simply change our beliefs to align with our current lifestyle. That's a lot easier, frankly. It's a lot simpler. It's one route to go. The other route is this: stand for God and withstand the heat. And you're going to face some heat. If you stand for God, you just got to know you're going to have to withstand the heat. And to say, I'm going to do what God wants me to do, even though I realize it may cost me something. It may cost me in the short term, but I trust that God's way is the best way in the long term. But either way, here's what we all know. Life here on earth would often be easier if we would just align or conform with culture. Because often taking a stand requires that we withstand the heat. Here's what happens. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. We will not give in. We will not conform." They knew their God had power, but they also knew that God had purposes. And they didn't always understand or know God's purposes. They didn't know what was going to happen if they were thrown into that fire. They knew that the love of God doesn't always separate you from the fire. But they also knew that the fire could never separate them from the love of God. And so, they weren't sure what God was going to do, but they were absolutely certain what they were going to do. They were going to honor God, even if it cost them something. I'm going to show you a picture of someone who decided to take a stand in her life as well. This is Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was 42 years old. The year was 1955. She had had a hard day at work, and she's riding home in Montgomery, Alabama, and riding on a bus. And before long, a white man wants her seat. And this is the law, and she refuses to give it to him, and so she's arrested for defiance. Here's what's amazing. She would later write this in her book. People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. I wasn't trying to make history that day, but I was ready to make a statement. And then I love this. I felt the Lord would give me the strength to face whatever I had to face. God did away with all my fear. It was time for someone to stand up, or in my case, sit down. I love that. She just determined, I'm going to take a stand. I'm going to stand for what is right, even if it costs me something. Even if it costs me, I'm not going to align with the norm. I'm not just going to conform to the way the culture is. If there is something that is wrong, and I'm not going to shame anybody else, but I am taking a stand. And this is exactly what these three young men did. They looked at the most powerful king in the world, and they said this: our God will give us the strength to face whatever happens. We will not bow down. You got to know, you're never more free than when you can get to that point. You're never more free. There's something liberating about knowing that the fire that is inside of you is deeper than the furnace that is before you. There's something so freeing knowing that I'm going to live by my conviction no matter what it costs. It means that even though these three young men were exiles, they were completely free. The king is so furious. You read the story. The king is so furious. Again, he's a king of extremes. He's so furious. He orders that the furnace be heated 7 times to what it is. I don't even know how you measure that. How do you heat it 7 times hotter? It says, he gets so mad, he says, heat the furnace 7 times hotter. He gets the strongest men from his army, and he says, bind them and throw them in the fire. And in the process of throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire is so hot that in the process of putting them in, the strongest men in his army are killed from the heat. That's how hot it is. And it's amazing. And here's what happens. Suddenly, Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Most scholars would agree that they believe this is Jesus who shows up in the flames with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is fascinating. Can you imagine the king looking out into the furnace? These guys are just hanging out, chit-chatting. Oh, they're no longer bound. They're no longer tied up. They're just walking around. It's absolutely fascinating. They call Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come out of the flames. And we're told in several verses that the flames didn't even touch them. In fact, it says not even a hair on their head was singed, and they didn't even smell like smoke. I've been around enough fall time campfires to know 15 minutes and you smell like smoke. It's amazing, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember I worked as a server in the smoking section of a restaurant. Came home smelling like smoke. These guys are in this incredible furnace, and the story goes and tells us they didn't even smell like smoke. There wasn't even that smell on them. Not a hair on their head was singed. And then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. They didn't want to die, but they were willing to die. And then, this This is again, the king of extremes. Therefore I make this decree. If any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. Like, chill, Neb. Take a Prozac or something, bro. There is no God who can rescue like this. What a statement when just before he said, when I throw you into the flame, what God would be able to rescue you from my power? And now he's completely flipped the script and says, there is no God who can rescue like this. Folks, we live in a culture that is moving further and further and further away from God. We live in Babylon. So don't be surprised when Babylon brings the pressure. And don't be surprised when you realize that Babylon has the firepower to back it up. At the same time, here's some things we can learn from their story that we can apply to our lives today. Number one is this: God meets you in the furnace. God meets you in the midst of the furnace. And when you take a stand in your own life and you just decide, I'm not going to shame people in our culture for not being followers of Jesus, for not believing in the same belief system that I have, the same values that I have, but I am going to live my life following God. I'm not going to conform to the standards of culture. And when you do that, when you determine I'm not going to conform to the demands of Babylon, I'm not going to bow down to the modern day idols that are competing for my attention and my affection, you can rest assured you're going to face the heat. And here's what I can tell you. God will meet you in the furnace. Faith does not guarantee the absence of fire. It does promise God's presence in the midst of the flames. That's the point. And if you're determined to follow Jesus in the midst of modern day Babylon, here's what you have to know. You're going to meet Jesus in the fire before you ever meet Jesus in the clouds. That's where he's going to show up. In fact, some of Jesus' own words to his own disciples in this life, he says, we will face trouble. And Jesus delivers these words on the very night that he is betrayed by one of his followers and arrested by his enemies. And this is what Jesus would say to his followers on that night. Here on earth, you will have many trials and sorrows. But take heart, because I have overcome the world. In other words, Jesus never said, don't be afraid, I won't let bad things happen to you. Jesus never said that. What Jesus said is this: you don't have to be afraid when bad things happen to you. It's a totally different way to look at life. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had this fire burning inside of them that was so much stronger and greater than the furnace that stood before them. Because somewhere along the way, they had learned to look at life through the lens of their faith, to look at life through the lens of eternity. They put into practice the words that Jesus would later say to his own disciples. He says this: don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot touch your soul. Don't be afraid of those who want to kill your body. They cannot touch your soul. This is why followers of Jesus through the centuries have been able to look death squarely in the eye and live with peace. To recognize, I don't want to die, but I'm willing to. Because death doesn't have the final word. Death doesn't have the final say. And so for followers of Jesus, what's made the biggest impact through the centuries is followers of Jesus who look death in the eye and live with peace. How is that possible? Look death in the eye and live with hope. How is that possible? It doesn't mean we don't grieve, but we do it with hope, and we live with such hope in the midst of, how is that possible? It's because we don't fear the one who can only kill the body. They cannot touch the soul. It's as if these three Hebrew friends understood this. They looked in the eyes of King Nebuchadnezzar and said, we're not afraid of the one that can kill the body. You cannot touch our soul. We will not give that part of it. And let's be honest, that can be a very scary and intimidating stand to take, because that means you're going to experience the furnace. It means you're going to experience the consequences of taking a stand to live your life following God's ways. And faith doesn't mean that you're always saved from the furnace. It means you never have to enter it alone. You meet God in the furnace. That also means that you trust God with the flames. You trust him in the midst of that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had faith that God could deliver them from the furnace. But you know, the most incredible part of their story is when they said, even if he doesn't, we will still trust him. Even if he doesn't, he's still good. He's still God. we still trust him. In other words, our lives are not in your hands, O King Nebuchadnezzar. They're in his. And our deliverance is sure. We're just not sure what it's going to look like. Obedience is our responsibility. The outcome is God's. We will do what we know is right, and God will determine what happens next. During World War II, before the United States got involved in the war, there was a famous event that took place. It's actually been made into a movie now called Dunkirk, but it's based on real events that took place. And the story of Dunkirk took place as 300,000 British soldiers were trapped against the Channel as Nazi Germany was marching across Europe and sweeping across the country. They were about to be wiped out when the most amazing thing happened. A huge amount of small personal watercraft made their way across the Channel by a bunch of civilians. Fishing boats, tugboats, small ships, small personal watercraft all came across the Channel and picked up 300,000 soldiers and brought them safely back to the United Kingdom. It's just an amazing story, but before anyone knew that they were coming and before any of the boats actually reached Dunkirk, there was a British officer who sent out a communication, and it had only 3 words: but if not. That British officer was quoting from Daniel chapter 3. And he was saying, we're hoping for deliverance and we're hoping for rescue. But if not, we will not surrender. But if not, we will not give in. But if not, we will not give up. We will give our lives if needed. Is our faith in God focused on his power? Or is it about trusting in his character? Do we follow because of what he could do for us? Or do we follow him because of who he is? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego delivered some of the most faith-filled and inspiring words ever spoken, even if he doesn't. We believe in his power. But even if he doesn't deliver us, we trust in his character. Some of the most powerful words in your life are the words, even if. At some point in your life, at some point in my life, every single one of us face seasons and situations where we have to lean into these words. God, I'm asking for you to do a miracle. I'm asking for your power. I'm asking for your deliverance. But even if you don't, I still trust you. That's the kind of faith that makes a difference in our world. This is a verse that our family leaned into big time just a few years ago. Many of you are aware our daughter 3 years ago was in a horrific car accident, airlifted to the hospital, life support. She was 14 years old. I had no idea if she was going to survive. The only thing we had was a phone call from a police officer saying she's unresponsive, critical condition, being airlifted. Stand by your phone, we'll tell you what's next. And in that moment, I can tell you, I leaned into this verse hard. God, please let her be okay. God, please, God. Begging, pleading, God, do a miracle. God, do a miracle. But even if you don't, you're still good. You're still God. And I know that situation could have gone the other direction, and I know for so many of us it has. This is where the faith of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego comes into play. God, even if you don't. God, even if, I'm begging you to heal the cancer, but even if you don't, I still trust you. God, I'm begging you, please, I want my husband, I want my wife to go to a counselor. I'm begging you to work on their heart. I'm begging you, God, make a difference in our marriage, but even if you don't, you're still good. Even if the whole thing falls apart, I still trust you. Even if our son or our daughter continues to drift, you're still good, you're still God. Even if a financial downturn becomes a recession, even if, I trust in your character. I believe in your power, but I trust in your character. They believed in God's power, but they trusted in God's character. And that is the kind of faith that makes a difference. The kind of faith that says, I will do what God asks me to do, even if it costs me. Is there an area of your life where you know God's asking you, where God's just highlighting something in your life and going, I want you to follow my way of living in this particular area of your life. And he's shining a light on it and going, if you'll do this, your life will flourish. I want you to do this. And you're going, yeah, but if I do that, it might cost me in the short term. I'm just telling you, It's so much easier to avoid the flames, right? But is it possible that God wants to do something incredible in your life, maybe even through your life, as a result of your obedience to him? God delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego out of the fiery furnace. And when you read the story, you got to acknowledge this is what you would call a grade A miracle. Top tier. This is different than like, man, I lost my keys, I prayed for my keys, I found my keys. It's a miracle. Couldn't find a parking spot, prayed for a parking spot, found a parking spot. It's a miracle. Totally different. I believe God is unlimited in his power. I believe God can do anything he wants to. And yet often God chooses to work through the natural and the normal, but God is not limited to the natural and the normal. And if and when and where he chooses, he can shift into the supernatural and the paranormal. If and when and where he decides to do that. And it is the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who gets the credit. It's their God who gets the credit. It isn't the three Hebrew friends. Listen to this verse again. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God." What touched the heart of Nebuchadnezzar wasn't just their deliverance. It was that they were willing to die for what they believed in. This blew his mind. And it's a good story. It would still be a good story, even if they died in the flames. The faith put on display wasn't only about God's power to deliver, it was about their faith and their trust in God's character. And King Nebuchadnezzar was impacted by their willingness to pay the price for what they believed. And he ends up giving glory, not to them, he gives glory to their God as a result. Because when you live with that kind of faith, the kind of faith that says, God, I trust you enough to do what you asked me to do, even if it costs me, then it points people to God. This is the third learning from this story. Let God turn heat into light. Let God turn heat into light. How many people followed God's ways in their lives and never experienced the heat? I would say very few. Think about the people who have made the biggest impact in your life personally, in your faith. Have they lived a life free of pressure and heat and difficulty? I'm guessing not. The scriptures are filled with the stories of people whose lives reflected an incredible faith and a trust in God in the midst of difficult and oftentimes seemingly impossible circumstances. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 11, Hebrews is a book written, and the reason we call it the book of Hebrews is because it was written in the first century specifically to Jewish people. It is a letter to the Hebrews. And as you read through this letter, there's a lot of it that is specifically written to this group of people who are Jewish people, Hebrew people, living in the first century, describing to them the way of Jesus. And in chapter 11, the author starts going through their history. Here's this person and this person and this person, and naming famous people in Hebrew history. And the incredible things that they accomplished and the incredible things that they did. And the author of Hebrews is writing this and says they were able to do these things because they saw themselves as exiles. They did not consider this place their home. They saw themselves as exiles. They were looking to a heavenly home. They were looking to something bigger. They were looking to something better. They were holding on to the promise that one day all things will be as they should be. And they held onto that promise, but none of them actually saw it come to fulfillment in their own lifetime. But that's how they saw the world. They saw themselves as exiles and foreigners in this world because their citizenship was in heaven. And then the author of Hebrews looks into the future and includes us in this list of people who trust God. Here's where we pick it up in chapter 12. The end of chapter 11, all of these story, famous people from Hebrew history. Therefore, and anytime you read therefore, you should ask what it's there for. And therefore, in light of this whole list of heroes from the past who lived this way, in light of this list of heroes who just had this incredible faith, therefore, in light of that, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, all of these people are these crowd of witnesses who are testifying, who are basically saying this life of faith is the way to live. In light of that, let us strip off every weight that slows us down. especially the sin that so easily trips us up, especially the idols that we're tempted to bow down to and conform to and align with. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this as we continue. Yeah, there we go. We do this, we're able to do that by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. It would have been easier to not deal with that. It would have been easier to just conform and align. But Jesus dealt with it. He endured it. And now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. So think of all the hostility he endured from sinful people, and then you won't become weary and give up. Let your faith be inspired by the example of Jesus. Maybe a better way for us to live in Babylon is to stop whining about the heat and start shining the light. We live in Babylon. We just have to acknowledge that the majority of people in our culture don't honor our values, hold our values, or follow our God. We're right where we need to be. Let's shine the light. And let's also remind ourselves, however bad you think it might seem, we are still some of the most blessed people on the face of the planet. We don't know anything about real persecution. We have brothers and sisters around the world who are literally facing the furnace, who are literally facing death. Last year around the world, more than 5,000 people were put to death for following Jesus. Just in one country alone, today it's estimated that between 50 and 70,000 followers of Jesus are in prison camps in North Korea. I know many of us are going through a furnace type of season in our life. It may not be specifically persecution, but it's something that's causing you to feel the heat in the way that you never have before. Could we have the courage to pray what followers of Jesus have prayed? Could we have the courage to say, God, I trust in your power to deliver, but even if you don't, I trust you. Even if you don't, you're still God and you're still good, and I'm following you not for what you can do for me. I'm following you because I trust in who you are. I trust in your character. And could we take the heat that's going on in our life and use it to be a light to point others to God's greatness? This is the God that we're invited to follow. This is why we were created. We were created to exist in loving community with God and each other, and yet every one of us, from the first human beings to every one of us today, at some point said, God, thanks but no thanks, I got this. And it created brokenness between us and God and us and each other. And we know this from our own life experiences, and so at the right time in human history, God sent Jesus into the world. And Jesus came into this world, and he loved well. And he lived well, and he pointed us back to God, and then he allowed himself to be put to death. His body was laid in a tomb, and according to multiple eyewitness accounts, hundreds of people saw Jesus alive again after he rose from the dead. And that means that death is not the end. There is more to this life than this life, and you and I have been invited to be a part of God's family. If you've never said yes to that, I want you to know you're invited, and you don't have to behave your way in. You don't have to change everything. You start following Jesus, and God starts to change you from the inside out. So if you want to say yes to following Jesus, I want to invite you to do that by just agreeing with this prayer. God, please forgive me of my sins. The times where I've held you at arm's distance, done my own thing, conformed to cultural norms. God, just tried to make life easy or bowed down to certain idols that I just felt like would give me everything, security and significance. But God, all of it falls short. I realize I'm created to exist in community with you and others. God, I want to find my significance, my security, my worth, my value in you and being a part of your family. So I want to say yes to your invitation. Make me your son, make me your daughter, and help me to put my trust in you and follow you as best as I know how from this moment on. God, I want you to be the leader of my life. And God, I pray for every one of us who are following you. Give us the courage to withstand the heat. God, may we follow you not just for your power and what you can do for us, but because of who you are. May we live the lives that say, God, we know that you have the power, but even if you don't, we trust you. And I pray that as we do that, our lives would point people to you, to your greatness, to your love, to your grace. We pray this in your name. Amen.